Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal's Polyglot Software Development Podcast. Our guest today is Jake McKee. Jake is a long-time community and customer engagement person who's focused on building products and services with customers rather than for them, especially in an era of AI. Jake, glad to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm quite excited. The topic that you mentioned is something new to me. So, the lesser I know, there's no dearth of things I know less or nothing about. But that being said, the lesser I know about something, the more excited I am, just because there's more of an opportunity for learning here. So, the topic that you had recommended, we'll start there. We'll at least loosely start there, and we'll see where the conversation takes us in the next 45 minutes or so. But before we get into the topic, if you could just give a brief introduction about yourself and your company to our audience, Jake, that would be awesome.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a longtime community guy. I've been doing community and customer engagement work for basically all of my career at companies like LEGO and Apple, and for clients like Southwest Airlines and Cancer Treatment Centers of America and countless others. But my current role is I am a solo practitioner consultant that helps companies of all sizes understand and build and execute customer engagement programs.
Lovely. So you mentioned community-driven product development, and I asked you quickly before the call as to what that was, so I sounded less ignorant. But I'm going to ask you to sort of introduce that to our audience, right? So to a company, to a startup, or even a mid-sized company, what does community-driven product development mean? What is the role? Who's the person who plays that role? And if you could just speak a little bit about that, and then we can sort of delve deeper into it.
Yeah, so community driven product development is a term that I have developed over the years and a methodology I've developed over the years for how to insert passionate representative customer voices into the product development process itself. And the way I always describe it is if you overly simplify product development as a overall process to three stages, right? You have collection up front where you do a lot of work to really understand the market, to get all your voice of the customer research in place, your budgets, your specifications, whatever it is that you need to be able to prepare for stage two, the black box of product development, right? And we tend to put our arms around that collection of stuff, knowledge, jump into the product development black box and kick the door shut and lock it behind us and do some work, right? In the
Right.
dark of night, so to speak. And when we're some number of weeks or months go by, we have developed something, we pop our heads up and say, ta-da, and we move into stage three, verification, right? Where we do a lot of beta testing or usability testing or all the testing stuff, right? But it's this verification. Is what we built good? Is it functional? And as somebody who's been doing community work for a very long time, I have seen over the years how often customer voice, community voice doesn't get included in that black box, right? It's kind of impenetrable. And really small things that are just minor decisions can have big impact if you don't really address them until well after you've presented this product, right? And so years ago, I started building programs for how you insert, select, recruit the right voices and put them metaphorically and sometimes literally into that product development process so that as the team is developing, you've got some really interesting, engaged, smart customer voices that can really work side by side with the engineers. That doesn't mean you turn over the product development process to them. It just means that you've got another source of input and feedback and testing as you develop, as you're making those decisions. And there's a couple of
Okay.
really,
Sorry,
yeah,
sorry. Go
there's
ahead.
Oh, no, no, it's fine. So that's the concept, and there's a couple of really interesting things that kick off because of this process. One is obviously the most direct, right? You hopefully end up with better products at the end because you've had this feedback all along. But my old business partner used to call it the ugly baby syndrome, that everybody's seen an ugly baby, but nobody's ever had an ugly baby. Because when you build something, it's beautiful. You want to protect it with all of your might, right? And so the added benefit to this process is that when you go to launch, you're not starting your process of building customer advocacy and loyalty and defense, right? You're launching with a group of people that are already primed and ready to go, and depending on the community that you're developing into, or launching into, those voices are hopefully representative of the larger community. And so, people who might react in certain ways when we launch new products are much more inclined to listen instead of react first, when they know that their peers have been in this process from day one, and those peers are out there saying, it's great, we had a hand in it, don't think that this wasn't thought about, we did, but it didn't go anywhere, or had a problem, those sorts of things. And so there's a much more deep intersection and interconnection between company and customer than when we develop in the dark and then launch and start our marketing programs.
That was a brilliant introduction, right? I have a lot of questions.
Yeah,
Okay.
please.
So just to, sometimes I end up restating what the
Mm,
guest says, just so I can digest it in my own words
sure.
and in my own accents. So excuse my repetition here. And if I interrupt you as you go, Jake, my apologies. Just want to make sure I'm
Yeah, no worries.
following as we have this conversation. So you mentioned three stages perfectly. So the first one, loosely speaking, I'm going to just paraphrase what you had mentioned there. Research, trying to find out what it is that you kind of want to be able to
Mm,
build. Stage two is the black box of product development. Everyone's going out there getting stuff done from an engineering
mm,
standpoint. Uh, and then stage three is what you said, verification, right? So I want to talk, and you mentioned a lot about what I'm looking at as product market fit, right? So
mm.
before I go to my specific questions, can I say that community driven product development is similar or helps better product market fit? I don't know if I'm phrasing that sentence correctly. I'm just trying to draw a connection between community driven product development and
Mm.
uh, product market fit for the products that somebody's setting out there to build, essentially.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. And I think if you could break down each one of those stages, collection, development, verification, as their own series of, we could have this discussion about each one of those three, but in each one of those, there's processes. Those processes don't don't change, or at least don't change much, right? How you develop is still going to be how you develop. Think about it more like, if you have a colleague from marketing who really understands the process of understanding product market fit, right? And you want them included in your meetings. You want them in their voice to be present as you develop, so that they don't come back at the end and say, well, geez, I wish I had known about this. We could have done something different, right? You're still doing product market fit. You're still doing voice of the customer research. You're still doing a lot of those things that you would normally do anyway. It's just you're adding one more component to this process that, sort of the old fighter pilot axiom that slow is smooth and smooth is fast, right? You're just kind of slowing yourself down, getting more input at the right stages of the process, so that what comes out at the end is actually, could be faster, but is certainly less error prone, right? And
That's very important that
yep.
you mentioned that, right? Let me ask you, when you say, when does this come into play? So let's say somebody has an idea. Right? A lot of us wake up with what we believe are great ideas, right? And,
Mm.
as somebody who runs a company, we build products day in and day out. I've gone through this many times in my life. You wake up, you're like, oh my God, I've got the world's most brilliant idea. Nobody's ever thought of this problem. This is amazing. I'm going to start building. When I was younger, I would actually literally start building, because I would be convinced,
Mm.
even without any further research of any kind whatsoever, that just because that idea dawned upon me, it's got to be a good idea. And if I'm able to build
Mm.
it, and here's the problem as a developer, right? Now, since you have kind of the skill to be able to build this and realize that it's actually a double-edged sword, as I've come to learn. It's not, because you start building it and then you recognize maybe you shouldn't even be doing it. Years have gone by, and now when I think of something as a great or brilliant idea, uh, I think about it the day after, 3 days after, and 5 days after, and 99 out of the 100 ideas make no sense on day number 4. I was like, why in the world was I thinking? There's already like 3 products out there, or 300 products out there.
Mm.
Was I under the influence of something, right? And then you figure there is like one product, and maybe there's a version of it very different from what you had originally envisioned that you're going to have to end up building, right? That's been my experience. Now, the reason I give you the background is when we talk about community driven product development and hearing the voices of the community, when does that come into play? Okay, Jake wakes up with a brilliant idea. Before Jake does anything more about it, is Jake going to find out what the community thinks? Or is Jake going to have to do something more so this community even understands whatever it is that you're thinking, right? Whatever it is that we're thinking, so they can actually provide feedback. Hopefully, I've articulated the separation
Yeah.
between those 2 points, right? Just want to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I'll also say that my humility over time, as I've grown older, has helped me understand that it, that my brilliant ideas most likely have already been thought about. There's as much of the question of not whether it exists or not as to whether it's a good idea or not in the context of the business or the customer base, those sorts of things. Because how many times have you started down a path that seemed obvious to you, and then you find out that there's legal issues that get in the way, or there's financial reporting issues that get in the
Or
way, and
just
all
the
of a sudden you're like,
expertise
oh,
itself,
geez,
right? Am I
right,
able to execute on that with the time, money, and resource? Yeah, I have a great idea to go to the International Space Station, but that's no good, right? You don't have the
right.
money or the skills to get there, so the idea is no good, right? So sorry. Yep, no, I
or
completely
or
agree.
I'm
Yeah.
in, I wake up one morning and I say to myself, man, it'd be really great if I could get all my bank accounts to combine and do this thing. And then I find out that there's laws in place that might not allow that. Right. I
Right,
don't know if that's
exactly,
true or
right?
not. I'm
Yep,
not a
yep,
financial
yeah.
guy, but those sorts of, oh, I didn't know. So part of so to answer your question, when does this get involved? I think so a huge part of what I do for a living is to figure out how to build these programs. And the programs, these CDPD programs, break down into 4 big components: finding the right people, putting them in at the right time, focused on the right outcomes, and using the right activities to keep them engaged throughout.
Hey, Jake, you're gonna have to say that again slowly because I try to, make a little bit of notes as we go so I can
Yeah,
follow
no
up on
problem.
that. So sorry, what are those 4 points? Finding the
So the
right
right
people, I got
the right
that one.
people, yeah, and that may, what does right mean in any of these examples? It depends, right? So and I'll kind of go through these a little slower one at a time. So the right people, that could be 4 representative voices from
Sorry,
an
Jake, if you could
existing.
just mention those items and then
Oh
we
yeah,
can go into
sure,
each of them. Yep.
sure. So the right people,
Okay, got
the
that
right
one.
timing,
Right timing. Okay.
the right outcomes that we focus on,
Right outcomes. Okay.
and then the right activities.
Perfect. Yep, you can start at the first one now. Yep.
Yeah.
Finding the right
Yeah.
people.
So to answer your question, like, how does the program like this work? The big answer, as so many answers are, is it depends. And it depends on a couple of things. One is, what do we really need? So let's say that you're a startup early on for a community that has a large community existing, right? A large developer community around some particular thing that already has a large following, and you want to try something new. Well, there's some danger in starting too early with too many people. So you might find 2 or 3 or 4 people that you know and trust that are representative voices from the community. Pull them in under NDA for an afternoon session, right? And find the right way to ask them the right questions, give them the right challenges, and see what's happening. And some of those things might not actually
And
be,
Jake,
here's our
sorry,
idea. Yeah, go ahead.
you're doing that before you've written the first line of code, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, you can.
Uh,
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm calling out for this because I've been guilty of doing it the not so correct way, and I know other people who do this who get overexcited and you start actually building something, and now with AI and with us having to do lesser and lesser, I feel like this problem could become more aggravated or exaggerated or whatever the right term is.
Mhm.
So what you're saying is before you start doing anything, right? You have an idea and you want to sort of figure out whether this makes sense or not. So
Mhm.
you're finding the right people, not right people to staff the team and start building software, but right people to from a community engagement standpoint, right? Hey, who
Right.
should I talk to get some feedback about this idea that I have in mind? But when you go before you go find those people, what kind of artifacts do you already have? Or do you have, I mean, other than the idea in your mind, what else do you have at that point?
Yeah, and so I'm if we start that early, we don't have to. There are times when I do projects that are, the product is 75% complete, and we're kind of doing a shakedown before it reaches the verification stage, right?
Is that not
Um,
too late already?
it maybe, but we can still find value there, right?
Okay.
There's the right way to do it, where for me as the community guy, I'd want to have a 15-step process that starts from the moment you think about it to the moment after we launch 6 months later. But we can do bits and pieces, right? Not everybody can afford full-blown programs. Sometimes what you need is not really, again, this is the right outcomes. So in your case, we're using this example of, I've had this idea, there's an existing community of people that I'm going to launch into. I don't have to create one from scratch. And so what I'm going to do is make sure that I am trying to figure out, what is it I'm trying to verify. I'm not having to build a whole piece of code or show them all my specifications. Again, I'll use that banking app just because that was the first thing that
Right.
popped into mind. What I might want to know is something about comfort of making those connections of bank accounts, right? Am I even in the right realm, right? I don't have to say, here's the thing I was thinking about. I don't have to think about, here's my code. I don't have to create a true clickable demo to put in front of them. I can. And I think that's what's going to be really interesting about AI here shortly. Sam Altman was talking recently about how by the end of the year, coding is going to be better done by AI than humans. I'm not sure if I agree with that, but that's what that's the timeline we're on, is that at some point here pretty soon, if not already, when we get an idea, we can throw together a prototype pretty fast, right? So if that's the case, then maybe we show a prototype. It doesn't have to be functional. It doesn't have to actually work like we want it to, but putting something in front of them is always better than nothing. That doesn't mean you don't have to do that, because again, I might, as I'm conceptualizing this idea, I may simply want to know, how do people react to this? I want to get some initial response. I want to see, I've realized in my own research that, boy, if people don't understand this in the first 14 seconds, they're not going to get it throughout, right? So can I come up with a messaging that gets them to understand that, or no, it's just too hard, right? I don't know. I'm making these ideas up as we
No,
go.
no, I think that makes sense, right? So that's your first point is okay. You have this idea, whether you have a prototype, whether you don't, whether you
Mm-hmm.
jotted it down, whether you have a Google Doc or a spreadsheet, however formal or informal your activity has been thus far,
Mm-hmm.
the problem you're trying to solve is trying to find the right people, and that right is a subjective term, right? In
It
other
is
words,
very much.
so could you take an example of, like, who would be, not who like as a person, but I would like to if you can have share an example of something that's a right set of people and then a wrong set of people for a hypothetical problem, right? Just so the audience understands the difference.
Yeah, so I'll tell you a story that will kind of sum this up pretty well. But before I do that, I'll tell you what the wrong kind of people are, and that tends to be the groups that fall to other focus points. So, for instance, um, market research people really love their panels because it's statistically valid data. I'm not interested in statistically valid data, right? I want that maybe in my voice of the customer reports, or my research reports, or my verification usability tests at the end. But what I'm looking for as the community guy is, what's the emotional side? How are people responding? What is the insights about the community that I'm not in all day long, and I don't understand as deeply as some of the community members themselves do. I'm looking for those little bits and hints, right, that I can turn into decisions, not just data, because data still has to be turned into decisions, and we need the qualitative, quantitative mesh to figure out how, where are we really at, right? And so, a lot of times when I start working with companies, they immediately go to, oh, we already have a customer advisory board, let's use them. Okay, but is that a sales, really is that a sales oriented function where you bring in a bunch of people that are your best buyers, and you say to them, here's our new products, what do you think? We've already developed them, and they, we sequester them on a golf course for a weekend or something, right? uh, that's very different than what we're talking about here. And so we may pull some of those people, but again, it's representation. We want these things to be representative voices for the stage we're at, for the audience that we're getting to, for the outcomes that we want at the end.
How do you do that mapping, Jake? I want to understand an example, if you
Yeah,
will,
so let me tell you
because
the story.
yeah, yep.
Yes, let me tell you the story. Maybe that'll kind of clear some of this up. So, when I was at Lego, we had the Lego Mindstorms robotic system that had been out at that point for about 10 years. Right, it's a technology product that had been out 10 years. You can imagine trying to create the updated version that would do even more and have more capabilities and allow us another 10 years, which was kind of the goal. Uh, it was going to be tough to make anything that was backwards compatible. Small, inexpensive 10-year-old piece of technology. You can imagine how would you make that backwards compatible for
Right.
any cost and any sort of engineering reality? Well, we couldn't. And the team that was working on that had started to develop, hadn't gotten they'd gotten decently far down from a technology standpoint. They had something that they were playing with as far as the core platform of technology that they were working with, but they hadn't gotten to a point where it was anywhere near released yet. And I kind of got wind of this, and I said, "Hey guys, time out. If it's not backwards compatible, we're going to have to find some way to make sure that this doesn't light the community on fire that already exists." Right? And we had at that point we had hundreds, if not thousands, of people around the country, around the world, using Lego Mindstorms to do all kinds of really cool stuff. You may have seen like the Rubik's Cube
Right.
robot that solved the Rubik's Cube, and printers that would look at one thing and use a pen to recreate it on another sheet of paper. All kinds of just absolutely amazing things. Well, that took thousands of hours and thousands of dollars and a lot of emotional energy an entire community of enthusiasts to get to that point of creating those things, creating the resources, sharing the resources. And I'm thinking to myself, my God, if we don't do something to get this launch done safely, we're going to end up with villagers with pitchforks and torches at the gates trying to raid the castle, right? and so I went to the team and I said, "Hey, this is the problem. This is what I'm concerned about. I'd like to find some representative voices." Now, let me put a pin in that representative voice thing for a second. And I want to put them side by side with you. I want to literally bring them into the process. And boy, at that time, I had to put every bit of political capital I had on the line. I had to beg, plead, and borrow. I had to make all kinds of agreements. I mean, I was not that far off from telling somebody I'd wash their car for a month if they'd just let me do this, right? But basically, the agreement I was, let me try it. If it doesn't work, we'll sort of contextualize this as let's bring them in for 6 weeks to get some feedback. If it works, we just keep on going. If it doesn't, all you're out is some time during that 6 weeks. And they said,
Right.
okay, fine, let's do it. So I spent 3, almost 4 months trying to find 4 people. Right.
Wow.
And the reason why that was so hard was because I needed a bunch of different things. I needed people that, those 4 people, that's how many I got agreement on. Those 4 people needed to represent the community. Right. Obviously, I wanted, when we put these people back into the community, to say, no, they were here. They were their voices. Therefore, your voices, larger community, were represented. I wanted everybody to say, hey, I wanted to be invited. Why wasn't I invited? Well, I mean, sure, those guys are pretty good. Yeah, I trust them. Right. So
Right.
that was number one. Number two was that they had to be personalities that weren't so nerdy that they were not easily connected to with they weren't they needed to be people that the product team would really enjoy working with, right? um, and they needed to represent various aspects of the community. I didn't want to get 4 different hardware people and completely miss the fact that there was software involved, right? That people had basically hacked and open sourced the software itself. Uh, there were people doing events. There were people that were doing community activities on a regular
So,
basis, and
Jake,
so
would these folks, would they be like pretty much full time onboarded onto the team, or are they playing an advisory role where they're sort of not an integral part of the team?
well, so that's where it gets fun. Is I found somebody that I found a hardware guy, I found a software guy, I found an events guy, and I found a community guy that represented kind of all the aspects of the Mindstorms community. We onboarded them in the first couple of weeks. It was kind of just getting them up to speed. The attention was nothing more than advisory, right? That's all we asked of them. We're doing something. I can't even tell you what it is until you sign the NDA, but trust me, right? I'd built up a relationship as the community lead at Lego with them. But when I did that, they said, okay, I trust you. I'll sign the document. Now tell me what it is. And when I told them what it was, and how I contextualized it is, I want to bring you in for a few weeks and let you give your opinions straight to the product team while they're developing this new product. And they said, oh, okay, cool. They didn't know who anybody else was. That literally we were trying to do as much top secrecy as we could to get them in before they even knew what it was about, right?
Right.
And we did, and it was advisory for the first couple of weeks until the hardware guys started saying, no, let me just send you some drawings. It'll be easier to communicate what I'm trying to say. And the software guys started saying, no, let me just send you some software, right? And before you know it, they were really immersed in the team. They were still volunteers. They were still working a limited amount of time, a few hours a week on this stuff. But they were having a great time, and the product team built a lot of respect for them. And in fact, they came back about halfway through the program and said, hey, can we get some more folks? Can we get 5 more? I think that would be really helpful. We have more questions. We have more ideas we want to run past people. And this became sort of an advisory board, so to speak, that was really immersed. They were shoulder to shoulder with them, and they were really in a lot of this work. I'm trying to recall, but I think we even expanded the NDA so that they were allowed to know a little bit more about what was happening. And of course,
Interesting. So that's basically, is there more to it in terms of finding the right people?
That was sort of I'll kind of recap those. I mean, one was the representation of the community. We needed to have good people that the community trusted as their representatives. We needed to have people that had the ability to create really great relationships and have great communication with the product team. And we needed to have the various sources of community activity represented as well. So it wasn't just sort of one type or another.
No, I think that it makes a lot of sense. I have some questions, but I want to go through the other 3 points, and I'll come back to my questions here. So you said finding the right people, and you mentioned the variety of different roles within that team of 4 people, right? You mentioned hardware, software, and so on. In other words, all of them don't have the same kind of expertise. You're finding people with a specific kind of expertise that's different from the other person. So there's no sense of redundancy there, so to speak,
Right.
right? So that's one. The second point you mentioned, right timing. What does that mean, right timing?
Yeah. So the right timing. This one's always important because, as we were talking about, right, where do you put them in? And you don't have to have somebody be present. You don't have to have a team present throughout the entirety of the development cycle. So, some of these development cycles can be a year, 2 years, sometimes longer, depending on the product. And for the group, that's 3 years would be way too long, right? You're starting to transition and go native, and the outside perspective doesn't last as long. But the right timing can be a 2-day session in the beginning when you're testing ideas, and that could be it. You could be done. Or that 2-day session could turn into a 6-week project a few months later when you start to develop, and you take some of those people or all those people and transition them into that group. Maybe not. Maybe you start with a whole different group. And then as you get closer to launch, where you're really dialing in the product, and you've got a tangible product in your hands, but you're trying to really make sure that everything's working like it needs to, and it's something you're not ready to beta test yet, right? Beta test is this thing functional, but you're still playing, right? It's still kind of ugly. It's still a little rough around the edges, if not really rough around the edges. And I've done programs like that where we bring in 40 people and send them a physical product and say, set it up, tell us what you think, right? But we're doing that on a regular basis so that it's not just, some of the problem with testing is it's these one shots, right? I'm going to ask you a thing, you give me a response, or I'm going to watch you through the 2-way mirror and see what you do. Those are really important, but when you're still developing, you really want people having an experience of, I've tried it 4 times over the course of several weeks, right? I've used the product, and it connected to Bluetooth the first time, no problem. But after 3 uses, when it gets hot, it starts to have a problem, right? And bringing
And
those
also
things back to
your
the product team.
involvement, right? Typically when something is new, you're quite excited to use it the first time, perhaps not so excited to use it the second time and the third time, right? So there is also,
Right.
there needs to be the time, the window of time. You couldn't squeeze that in.
Right.
It's like, one of the phrases I've heard is, you couldn't have 10 mothers to give birth in a month, right? It still takes the 10 months. So you need to have
Right.
that window of time for people to digest it. So that Makes
Yeah,
sense.
absolutely right.
The third point you mentioned there was right outcomes. What are the outcomes that we are expecting out of this exercise?
Yeah, and this was, to me, this is one of the biggest because as a strategist for a long time, I'm always surprised how many teams I go into and they're like, "Let's just get started." Like, hang on, what are we actually trying to achieve here, right? What is the purpose of why we're doing what we're doing? And again, if you bring in people for a 2-day session, what are you trying to do? Get those goals tight. We are trying to show them a concept in this form to get these points of feedback, right? And that will allow us to know these things. If we're sending out 40 different physical units, what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to get them to just have, like you say, have a window of time? How long is that window of time? What are we trying to learn from that? What do we need to watch out for as we go? Right? All those pieces of why are we here and why are we doing this? I think in a lot of times people can get really excited about new kinds of programs and just say that sounds fun. Let's add that to the roster before they really think about the why. And it's one thing if you say you get excited about installing a new piece of software in your enterprise, right? If nobody uses it, okay, well, no big deal. But with these sorts of things, what you don't want to do is start off kind of haphazardly without a whole lot of thought. Like we got a group going, and this is the fourth piece, the activities. We got a group of people going. They were really excited to be here. We sent them a product or gave them access to our service or whatever it might be. And then we didn't talk to them for 2 weeks, right? We need to understand, going in, this is good, and to communicate this so that they have expectations set, right? The 40 product project that I talked about, we onboarded those 40 people and told them we're getting together once a week, once every week as a team on a Zoom call. You can give feedback. We're going to send you this product. We'd like you to use it over the time. And we also then had these little small rituals, little hashtags on their Facebook. We had a Facebook group for them. When they gave feedback, certain types of hashtags. Some of them were helpful for the product team to organize. Others were just fun, but that was the rituals. Some of that organically came up, and we watched for that, and then seized on it. Other things that, when things would get slow, we were kind of prepared to say, "Oh, here's today's challenge," and sometimes that was a weekly challenge to prepare for the call, or sometimes it was just a random little small thing just to have some fun, right? But the idea was I think that program, I'm trying to recall, I believe that was an 8-week program that kind of extended itself to about 12 weeks. Um, Again, the product team was like, just give it a few weeks, it'll be fine. And then we got all this rich insight, and all of a sudden the product team was saying, "Well, this is really great. Can we keep going?" Um, and the activities is what keeps people, you know, having fun, connecting with the other people in the group, right? And you always know you've done a good job if you start to see people meet up offline, right? Oh, you're in Philadelphia, I'm in Philadelphia. Let's go, hang out and play darts, down the street, because we're not that far from each other, and you're creating those bonds that then obviously sort of fuel that advocacy when we launch. And products sometimes launch imperfectly, and there's a whole group of people you've just created to help do that, right? You've empowered them to go out and be your advocates.
Wow, that's quite amazing. So the two things that come to my mind for me to ask you is when you said the right set of people, uh, it's a two-part question really. One is it this, I'm wondering, here's what I'm trying to ask. I'm trying to see how to phrase that correctly. You have four people in your example. You found them.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if the first objective is to see if this is even an idea that's worth exploring or not. Let's take an example where you have an idea and you're not exactly sure if this makes any sense. So you find the right set of people to vet that idea with them. Now, once you've vetted that idea and you feel like they tell you that, you know what, Jake, it makes sense, do you then find, is it the same set of people, or you find a different set of people to dig deeper into that idea? Because I'm just wondering whether it's when we say the right set of people, it's not the same people who become the right set of people at every phase
Right.
of this project. That right set of people might continue to evolve, right? Before you have anything in place, you want to ask to about this idea to somebody, but once you have something in place, you might want to ask how good or bad it is, perhaps to a different set of people. Is it typically the same set of people, or is it different sets of people?
I don't know that there's a typical, but it goes both ways. So here's an example. Let's say that you're in the ideation stage. Do you want the hardcore developers in that feedback session? Maybe you want their voice represented. Maybe there's one out of the 5 people that you've invited that is a hardcore developer. But the you kind of look to the end. What kind of product are we building? What do we need to know? But also, who are we building for? Because who you're building for may not be hardcore developers, right? They may be more casual users. So in the ideation stage, if you don't have a really strong representation of casual users, which are your end customer, that can be really problematic. But you're not going to necessarily bring in a big group of casual users to work side by side with the product team because they don't have a lot of product understanding. That may just create resistance with the product team. You may bring in a combination of developers and more casual end users, or just developers, right? That can really work side by side. The interesting thing about that Lego project is that with that one, the ideation phase was sort of a given, right? We had business reasons why we said a 2.0 version of this product needs to exist, right? We had all these other things that were dependent on it. The first Lego League used it. The community was growing. We wanted to target younger children. Robotics itself was becoming a bigger thing in society generally. So that sort of business decision to make it had already been decided. There was some foundational level development that had started to get somewhere with the platform. So when we brought these 4 in, it wasn't like they were starting from scratch and we were asking them, should we do it? That had already been decided. We asked them as hardcore users to help us refine it and to bring an outside perspective into, will this kind of battery last long enough for an event, right?
Right.
With the way
Okay.
that it
Now
pulses
that
or whatever, right?
makes sense, right? The second part of my question was, let's say you found, let's say it's someone like me for as one of those people.
Mm-hmm.
Now I want to play two roles here. Right? One is I might be willing to provide that feedback, and I might even have the expertise to provide that feedback. But
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't mean I'm engaged. And what I mean by that is, what if I am not particularly stoked about that idea? I mean, when you find the right set of people, how do you find? I mean, what do we need to be? What do we need to do to be careful about finding somebody
Mm-hmm.
who both has an expertise, so whatever feedback you receive, it is actually valuable, and two, you know that they sort of are interested in whatever it is that you're building. You know what I mean? I mean, just to make
Mm-hmm.
sure that that person is not just somebody who is able to give feedback because they have the expertise, but they also are very excited about that idea.
Mm-hmm.
Or is that something that's not, that does, I mean, does it matter? And how do you ensure that you find people that kind of play fit into those, satisfy both those expectations?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and honestly, so this is the magic of what I do in a lot of ways is to figure out how do we. When I do recruiting, for instance, I don't just find people that look good on paper and then invite them. I have a conversation with. I'm trying to think if there's an example I haven't done this with. I don't think there is. I have a conversation over the phone or over Zoom with literally every single person I've ever invited to any of these programs. And the reason for that is to understand what's their personality type. What do they get excited about? How do they fit with, how do they interact with me? And we all know that there's some people that just cannot connect with other humans, but they're really good at a certain type of coding or development or ideation or whatever it might be. There are other people that are really good connectors, but beyond that, don't have as much to offer for a program like we're doing. And so, this is part of, if you walk into a really talented therapist and say, hey, doc, here's my problem, they can almost immediately recognize some patterns based on experience and just the deep study they've done over the years of how people work and the best practices of psychology. And I've said 5 keywords and they go, I'm going to assume it's these 5 things. Let me test that theory. Yep, those are the right 5 things. I kind of do the same thing in how I recruit. That's usually step 3 or 4 or 5 in the recruiting process. Um, the a lot of that's dependency on the community that we're pulling from and putting back into. So, I want to have that be, if we're pulling from a very nerdy community, I want to have a very nerdy group of people, right?
Right.
And
Okay.
part of that engagement too, even if you recruit as well as possible, if you've ever been to a house party sometimes you walk in and for whatever reason, everybody's just having a great time and talking to each other and it's just going nuts. Other times you walk in and it has all the exact same elements and the vibe just isn't there, right? And a lot of that comes down to the party hosting. Who's the person that when you open the door, they say, "Hey, it's great to see you. I want to introduce you to 3 people. Warm introduction. Off we go." And now you have somebody to talk to, and all that sort of thing. Versus you knock on the door, it kind of creaks open. You stick your head in and say, "Am I in the right place?" And everybody kind of stops and looks at you, and then goes back to what they're doing. Very different vibes, right? And so part of the reason I call these programs and not just research projects or something is that we think about when we design these things. Again, these are the activities. What kinds of activities do we do to onboard them, to introduce them to each other, to get them talking? This is in many ways this is a huge part of my function is the party host, to get them really connecting with each other and
So
opening
in
up
other
and
words,
feeling
there
comfortable.
is certainly is a human element to this, right? To
Oh,
make to
absolutely. Yeah.
facilitating that, you're finding the right people, going through those steps, but sort of doing them in not a very mechanized manner, because as you
Right.
mentioned more than once, it just depends on the type of problem, right? The
Hmm.
community is going to be different. There's a lot of subjectivity around this, right? Where you have to
Right.
work with the subjectivity. Like when does this come into play? You mentioned it can be a 15-step process where you get started on day one, or you had another example where it's 75% of the way into the product, and then the community comes into play. I know
Right.
we have about 5 minutes left. One other thing I want to ask you, Jake, was what are some of the tools that you use, right? I know there's a human element, but if you use some tools and some tools that you could recommend, so somebody who's watching or listening to this can also benefit from those. Are there some tools that you use to help you be successful in this effort?
Yes, but you're going to laugh that a lot of this is pretty low tech in a lot of ways. The biggest thing that I use from a technology standpoint is some sort of discussion platform that allows people to engage in a group, right? So I've used Facebook groups, I've used Slack, I've used Discord, I mean, back in the day, I used Yahoo groups, right? Like any sort of discussion platform that allows people to connect to each other and hopefully be able to see some threading and that sort of thing, because we're hoping we get a lot of engagement, right?
Now, but how
Some
do you channel that? So let's say you have those people and
Mhm.
they are providing feedback, some useful, some perhaps not so useful, but you have to channel that and create a meaningful representation of that to communicate that
Mhm.
to the team, right? So is that what happens, or do they
Yes,
engage with the
so
team directly?
little of both, but so part of what you're talking about is the workflow from the sort of unstructured ideation and discussion into actionable things that the product managers can pass on to the engineering team in whatever structured way that they use. And there's a it always starts with what are they already using, right? So if you're already using Jira to track your development process, uh, or you've got Confluence boards where you saving core discussion points in the same place, then that's what we're going to keep using. And the question is, how do we transition between that unstructured and the structured? There's a lot of things we can do to make a little bit more structure in that discussion environment. So, like I was talking about hashtags earlier, right? Um, there were some hashtag ways of allowing us to sort of create a ritual that when somebody gives feedback of one type, it's hashtagged one way, feedback of another type, it's hashtagged another way. And we were basically saying, look, help these real people product managers out by doing these tags, because then they like you more, right? It makes it easier for them to translate that data. And they all went, oh, okay, cool, happy to do it. And then me as the program leader would come in and sort of be like, hey, don't forget to put that tag in there. And then they started adding the different tags for the type of feedback, but then they'd also add tags that said submit my feedback or making Jake happy or something like that. That was just part of the fun, but it was a way to sort of create some structure around that. The product manager still went through and assessed it, and then they'd turn it into just the way that other feedback comes into whatever systems that they're already using. Just like if the CEO came and said, hey, I've got to do this, what would you immediately do? You'd open a ticket, you tag the right people in it, and off it would go into the process, right, to get prioritized and developed against. But
And then the core objective, essentially, Jake, is just to reiterate the most important point here, right? That you don't end up building something that you feel very strongly about, but there isn't much of a community out there that's looking for something like that, right? I have
right,
a question that's follow up. It's a follow up to this, but is that a fair thing to say that you
yeah,
want to make
absolutely.
sure that, right? You don't build something, but let me play the devil's advocate there, right? If you took a company like Apple, for instance, again, this could be a preposterous example of taking the example of the largest company that's out there, but I think it's still all right. I'm going to give this a shot. So uh, there's two approaches, right? Let's say there's two exactly opposite ways of doing perhaps the same thing. One is the way that we've discussed so far. Get the engagement of the community as early as you possibly can,
Mhm.
work with them, and then build what makes sense, right? So what you're building is not a doesn't end up being a complete disconnect from
Right.
what's needed. But let me take this quote that's loosely attributed to, I think, a Henry Ford, but I'm pretty sure he's not the one who said this. But internet always attributes quotes to the wrong people. But forgetting who said it, the quote, regardless, is a good one, which I'm sure you've seen. Is if you ask customers what they wanted, they would have said they wanted fast horses, right? Not a car or something along those lines. I don't know if
Right.
you've seen that one.
Oh yeah.
It's
Yeah. Many
essentially
times.
saying sometimes you go to people and ask them what they want, and they tell you something, and maybe they believe they want it, maybe they don't know what else they could potentially want, because they are only
Mhm.
able to answer those questions based on their experience and what technologies that they have currently been exposed to at that point of time. So to somebody who's thinking, hey, you know what, I did everything correctly, at least on paper, engage the communities, found the right people at the right
Mhm.
time, try to come up with the right outcomes and facilitated the right activities. But despite doing all of this, I found the wrong answers because either I wasn't sure or they weren't sure what I was asking them.
Mhm.
They ended up coming with the wrong set of answers. Now, what happens then? I mean, is that scenario unlikely? Where you're like, you know what, your people are coming up with the wrong set of answers, or do you have to prepare to be able to tell the difference between the right set of answers and the wrong set of answers, because you either pose the questions incorrectly, or you ask the wrong set of people, or you just things somehow didn't turn out as the way you expected for them to be, as somebody who's leading or facilitating this community driven product development, right? I know I used a number of words and a bunch of sentences there, but hopefully the crux of what I'm trying to ask there was not lost in my verbosity.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And so let me break that down a little bit. The Henry Ford quote is a good one in general, but I always respond to that quote because it's come up a number of times, right? That, we don't want to just ask customers what they want because they won't give us any good answers. If you asked them for the car before they knew such a technology even existed, of course they're not going to tell you what they want. And also, you've asked the wrong question. You've left it far too open ended, right? The customer is not the person who's getting paid to spend all day at work thinking about complex issues, right? What you're asking the wrong question if you just say, something so broad that all they can say is, within my context, I want a faster horse. If you ask them, hey, what's your biggest challenges with getting your product to market? Oh man, it's super uncomfortable. It takes forever. By the time it gets there, anything that requires refrigeration's dead, whatever. I don't know what it might be.
Right.
What you're doing is closer to psychology than anything else, right? You don't walk into your therapist's office and sit down and she says, what's your problem? And you say, well, here's exactly what my problem is. I need to fix all these 5 things, right? It is an exchange. I'm sharing what I know. They're asking me based on what they know so that we can find something that feels right to both of us in between. And I
So
think
there
that
is a
that's
process of discovery there, then, right?
absolutely. And this is not replacing any of this. One of the myths is I always talk about the Homer Simpson car. If you've ever seen the episode of The Simpsons where Homer meets his brother who runs a car manufacturer, and the brother says, "This is so great. I have a brother. Why don't you come in and design a car for me? You're the average man. You're the real people. I'm going to turn the product team over to you, and you design the car." And so he designs this awful looking car that blows up on stage when they reveal it. right? Because it wasn't that they were implementing him into the process in the right way. They turned the process over to him and gave up all of their knowledge that they're just, they were very skilled designers and they just said, meh, we're out, right? And that's not the goal here. The goal is to provide another source of a different type of decision making. And how do we balance what we know and what we do with data with what we can get from people talking to us and understanding and listening for cues, instead of just saying, oh, we did a survey, here's the answer, cool, we're done. We're saying, just like a therapist might, that's an intriguing point I hadn't thought of. Can we dive into that some more? Right. And now I've got an idea. Maybe I even say, and this happens a lot in these programs, is we may hear from the community members that are participating that they're really wound up about something. And we go, man, I just don't understand this, but I understand it's an issue now. Hey, market research team, can you go look into this topic that I hadn't even thought of before and they didn't even know existed? Oh, off you go to do your traditional means, but you're adding a different way and a different perspective for getting to some of the work that you normally do, right? We're not replacing anything, we're appending it with more power, basically.
Makes sense. We have 10 minutes to go, and I'm going to kind of deviate from what we're talking that a little bit.
Sure.
Right. This is amazing, by the way, right? Thank you for all of that you've
Of course.
shared with us so far. The question I have now is, a lot of what you mentioned there has has a human element. It needs human
Mhm.
intervention. It's a process of discovery, and there's a lot of subjectivity. Correct? I mean, is it, before I ask the question,
Yeah,
would it be fair to
absolutely.
say that, Jake? Okay, I'm going to ask this question. It's not a rhetorical question, even if it comes across that way. As we're having this conversation in March of 2025, a question that's on everyone's mind is there Optimus that's going to do this? I think Optimus is a random example of what Tesla is claiming to build or is building out there. But AI, right? A lot of what we talked about, one of the questions every time I talk to people, there is this concern, this anxiety, this excitement, this fear, you name the emotion that's there
Mhm.
as to AI being able to do some or all of it. And you alluded to it at the top of this call as well, as something that Sam Altman had mentioned. I think I heard a video where Anthropic CEO had said, and I had a chat about it with somebody 2 days ago, a whole 2 hour conversation around when is AI going to replace us, right? Is it a question of if, or is it just a question of when? So, to all of that you just spoke, Jake, do you see a couple of questions? Do you see AI completely replacing this person who's doing the facilitation, right? Hey, I have to sort of find the people, create the activities, make sure the outcomes are right, and said that make sure the timing is correct. A human has been doing this for the most part, at least. Question number one: do you see AI doing it? If so, do you see AI doing this in entirety or some parts of this? And the third part of the question is, when do you see that happen? Are you seeing that happen in the next month, 3 months, or do you think it's a little bit out there? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so all good questions, and I'll be interested to put a pin in this. So it's St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, 2025, as you can tell from
Happy
my green
St.
shirt.
Patrick's Day
It's
to
happy
everybody who's
St. Patrick's
celebrating.
Day.
Yeah.
That's why my grandmother would be very angry with me if I wasn't wearing my green today. But so we can mark this date. That if we come back in a year, I'm gonna be completely wrong. It's so hard to really understand right now. But here's my take. I don't think that I don't think that's the right question. And I think fundamentally, yeah, AI is already replacing a lot of things. It is helping me in my daily work in ways that are fantastic, right? I have a sparring partner. I think really well out loud, but as a solo practitioner, sometimes I just am sitting here in my office alone going, hey, Jake, what do you think? Well, I don't know, Jake. Well, that's not a very good opinion, right? It doesn't work. But with AI, I can come up with an idea. I toss it in. It searches what has already happened in its database and says, well, based on what's already happened, here's some ideas. And I go, oh, those are great. And if I stop there, I'm not doing very good, right? Because yeah, I saved some time, but that's all I saved. That's all the improvement was a little bit of time saving and probably a lowering of quality because I'm not really adding anything humanistic. I'm not adding anything creative. I'm just simply based on what's already happened. I'm getting closer to that, right? If I'm an author and I hire an editor to help me improve my words, that's not a problem. But if that editor comes in and says, I want to change this to be just like every other book that's ever been written, instead of doing something unique and new, maybe I sell some copies, but it's not going to be a bestseller, right? It's
Right.
not going to be a unique work of art. And I think that that's where we're at. Is the question I'm asking is, yes, of course AI is going to replace some things. What does that allow us to do? Right? What do we where do we fill in that extra work? Are we starting to create more, magic wand type of concepts that we never could have thought about before because we were too busy doing all the manual coding? Well, now if AI is helping us code, does that free us up to be thinking more creatively, more broadly, more you know uh big picture, aspirational?
So, Jake, in other words, rather than fight a losing battle with AI and defend the position, defend the role, defend what somebody is
Mm,
doing, what I hear is you take AI as a tool, which is what it is, right? As
mm,
a set of growing tools with that's becoming that are collectively becoming more and more powerful, and find out what else could you possibly be doing, right? Can I be solving problems that I thought I couldn't solve in my
right.
lifetime because I did not have all the money or the time or the resources?
Mm,
But that's kind of what I mean. I couldn't agree more because I feel the exact same way. People have asked us all along, as a company that's not too big, where we build a lot of these tools and products and technologies, we've generally been told, oh, you know what, you guys, do you have enough people, enough money to do this? And we've kind of, as there's been no shortage of skepticism along the way. And
mm.
I'm speaking this for every founder, right? We've all been subject to it. And you try to back yourself and do what you can. And that's
Right.
even before AI was available for the most part,
Mm,
right? And now when you have AI available, you're like, you know what? I don't even think I need the number of people I thought I needed or the amount of money I thought I needed. I can do with fewer people, lesser
mm,
money, but I can use the right set of tools as long as I'm finding those tools, finding the right. There's a number of them as we speak on a daily basis, and I reckon 95% of these tools are going to cease to exist in the next 3 years because everybody claims to be doing something that's AI related,
mm.
and it's up to each one of us to be careful about whatever it is that we're investing in, right?
Right.
In terms of
Right.
time and money
Absolutely.
and picking the right set of tools. So that I think makes complete sense. I know
Yeah,
I
and
want to.
I think there's one exception to that, but if we when I got out of college, I went straight into a web development firm. I went to school for traditional product design, and got out, and my first job was at a web startup, right? And we were building websites by hand, and my job was the kind of the integrator role, right? I took the designs that the designer would make. I was employee number 3, so I took the designs the designer would come up with in Photoshop, and whatever the coder was doing with whatever database things he was doing, and I put them into something that was usable to the world, right? And at that point, it was all manual, and there was this thought process that we had to get really good at HTML coding, and that was the career was an HTML coder and website builder. Well, then look at what's happening now. I can go on Wix or Squarespace and make a site that in a matter of minutes that previously was just days or weeks of work to get to, right? And what is it allowed? It's allowed everybody for whatever they want to do, whether they're selling products or starting a charity or just getting out information for whatever they're doing. Me on my
YouTubers are selling merchandise, for instance, right?
right, yeah, and it makes
Anybody.
that incredibly easy. But the shift has been to a point of creativity, right? If the administrative issues don't take a bunch of time, I've got to start thinking about what am I going to sell? What's going to be a good seller? How am I going to approach that? And I think that that AI is allowing us to do the exact same thing, just on a much grander scale, with the one caveat that this is the first time in history that we are training technology to replace us ourselves, right? I didn't train Squarespace how to replace me specifically, right? We are doing that. We are training AI how to replace
Not
the
technology,
skills we're
but
doing.
we've actually trained. I'm going to take an example. I don't know whether it's politically correct. I mean, I don't care. You. There are times where you train somebody who's located in a different part of the world,
Hmm.
where it's more optimal or cost efficient, for lack of a better word, where you're training somebody. that's going to replace you, right? I've done
Mhm.
that many times
Oh yeah.
myself. I
Yeah.
mean, I was building something using Node.js for somebody. We built it for 6 months as a company. And then once they have it, they're like, you know what? This is awesome. We have most of what we need to get started. But at this point, you guys have given us a good amount of
Mhm.
functional code. I don't think we want to continue paying you these top dollars or
Right.
whatever those top dollars meant. We can give it to somebody else. But it's kind of funny, but it's not surprising that that handoff happened while we were in the mix of things, right? We were building it
Mhm.
and we had the other team and we were training them as we were doing it, so to speak,
Right.
right? Knowing fully well the whole purpose of that effort. And there's no hard feelings because everyone's trying to make a living. I was like, you know what, if I were on the other side of the spectrum, I mean, I would be learning from this other person who
Mhm.
built it and who's giving it to me, right? So, like you mentioned, the only difference here is, it's not a human; it's a technology that's
Right.
sort of helping you replace yourself, and
Well, and
maybe
is exponentially growing in its power as we train it, right?
as
Uh,
we
it's not a one-to-one, one person to another person, and then you turn it over. It is exponentially growing without human intervention. But I do think that to really to answer the question, how does AI impact all the community-driven product development work that I do? I still think that there's a lot of value there, and I still think that in some ways it becomes even more important when it's easy for me to answer some prompts and outspits an app that may be totally functional here before we know it, and can immediately go up to the Apple's App Store and be used. It becomes even more important to slow down, to figure out why we're doing what we're doing, to watch for signals that are important for. Yeah, I can. Again, this is the backwards looking, right? Every LLM right now that exists isn't looking at the future; it's looking what's already happened. So if I want to create something net new, I still got to think about it up here, right? I can be
you know
prompted and advised and inspired by what's happened before in a way that I never have before, which is
you
amazing.
said exactly what the last conversation that we had, Jake, I had, with somebody I'd worked with in the past. His name is Jason. When you publish the podcast, I'll send you a link. That's the summary of what we
Please.
discussed was exactly what you said there, right? Because
Hmm.
the whole notion of the LLMs is they're going to do as much as they can and as smart as they can based on data that's already existing, right? Which means
Hmm.
things that have transpired, which means when you talk creativity and being creative, it's only, I don't know, I could be saying this wrong, but I'm just saying, how can you be creative if the whole premise of what you're doing is based on what has actually happened and it's in the past, right? You're
Right.
you're basing your decisions on data, and maybe there is still time for this creative part of the human brain to be replaced, right? Maybe we are not there yet as we speak. I have one other non-technical question for you, which is a little bit
Well,
about
and here,
Austin.
just to put a
Sorry,
pin in that
yeah.
point before we move on, I I absolutely believe that a lot of these routine tasks will go away. And if we don't, as a species, figure out how to reinvigorate our own creativity, that's where we're going to have problems. It's not from the AI, it's from the lack of creativity, as far as I'm concerned. And that's why it's so scary to me right now to be watching so many schools focus so much on just math or science or computer programming, and moving so far away from the humanities, right? The art, the sociology, the psychology, the
Oh my God, you
creative.
mentioned a very important point there. I know we are at the top of the hour. Do you have a few more
I
minutes
do.
to
Yeah,
talk
we can
about
keep
that?
going.
Okay, you can tell me when you have to be done because I love chatting, as you can tell, and I'm learning quite a bit here. So you mentioned the last point that you mentioned. It's very interesting to me, right? So let me ask you this. So STEM, right, or STEAM,
Mhm.
they've added arts into that. In some places, I see it says STEAM,
Mhm.
but it's science, technology. Was it STEM? Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, right?
Yeah,
That's the acronym,
yeah.
right? And just by way of background, not that you're going to be surprised, I was born and raised in India. I've lived most of my life here in the US at this point.
Mhm.
But your formative years, it's almost impossible to change the impressions that have been cast upon you when you grew up,
Absolutely.
right? No matter
Right.
no matter how old you become. So growing up in India, and I know a lot of our podcast listeners and watchers are based out of the US, some in Europe, but I know there's a percentage of people, a small percentage that watch from Southeast Asia as well. So
Mhm.
I don't want to offend anybody. And especially because I come from India. But the general emphasis, Jake. Before I state the obvious, let me ask: have you traveled? Like, have you traveled to India
I haven't
in
been
your
to
year?
India, but I've traveled quite a bit over Europe.
Oh, Europe. Okay, Asia. But have you been to Asia?
Not yet.
Okay, I actually tell people very different world, right? Very, very different
Mm,
world. Europe's unique. I'm not saying it's not, but there's a lot of commonalities, right, between the US
sure.
and Europe
Yeah.
in many different ways. Asia is a different beast altogether. And even within Asia, India and each country is unique, right? China and
Mm,
Japan and India. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Uh, Growing up, we are given a few choices, at least historically. And, they say when you migrate, time stops. I'm going to speak to it when I migrated, which was like 100 years ago. But I think it's true for the most part, even today. We are given a couple of choices when it comes to career by our parents, right? Do you want to become an engineer? Oh, you don't want to be? Do you want to become a lawyer? Or not a lawyer? There's one more choice left. You can become a doctor. That's it.
mm,
It's almost like there is nothing else that's out there, right? Which makes no sense, but that's kind of how a lot of us grew up.
mm,
And then we're like, you know what? This doesn't add up, but that's the only thing we were subject to. So when I moved here, I was pleasantly surprised that you could be a pianist, you could be playing cello and be part of an orchestra and things like that, right? So I was very excited about those, even though I don't personally have any of those skills. It was very exciting to me. But years went by. I don't know how else to say this. Decades went by, and now I suddenly wake up one day and I'm like, I know I'm not living in India, but all the vibe around what I'm doing and who I'm talking to feels no different. Everybody is only talking STEM and engineering and mathematics, and
right.
it feels exactly the same way, right? So I'm like, you know what, this is sad in a way because I appreciated the difference and the change,
Mm,
but I feel like that is going away. But now that's why whatever you said that resonated with me there, Jake, because with AI coming, into the mix, being a lock, stock, and barrel, it begs that question. A lot of this engineering, a lot of the sciences, a lot of the math, a lot of that is something that seems to be easily replaceable. And what perhaps is not, in my mind, easily replaceable are those subjective things. Like when Yo-Yo Ma is playing the cello, I'm sure a robot can perhaps play the cello, but the intellectual creativity of being Yo-Yo Ma and being able to play the cello
mm.
is perhaps very different. I feel like, I mean, do you agree that, I know it's a long-winded question. It's a long question here, but the crux of what I'm trying to ask here is Krish as a developer more easily replaceable by AI than Yo-Yo Ma as a cellist, right? Is that correct to say that? I just want to get your thoughts on it.
It's hard to say because if you're talking about a performance cellist sitting on a stage playing the instrument, that maybe that's harder to replace. But if you're talking about recorded music right now, I can go on AI and say, go into an AI program and say, hey, make a Yo-Yo Ma style song for me from scratch. But what's it still going to do? It's still going to go backwards, figure out what Yo-Yo Ma's like,
Exactly,
and
yeah.
then try some other things, right? And I think that this is also very important to remember that creativity can show up anywhere, right? And if I don't know if you've read much about Einstein, but he was a passionate violinist, right?
Oh,
And
he was? I had no idea.
yeah,
I thought
and
all
he
that he did was
talks.
physics.
In fact, he met his wife, as I recall the story. He met his wife because he was as a young man being very very loud in his playing in this apartment building he was in, and she came and kind of knocked on his door and said, "Please pipe down. You're being too loud." Right?
Oh my God, I really
Um,
appreciate that story. I mean, like most people, I love Einstein, but I didn't know that story at all.
yeah, and if you go back and look at a lot of the sort of the more famous scientists, mathematicians, they all have some level of creativity to them. Now, whether it's mathematic creativity or whether it's like Einstein having this musical side interests or whatever else it might be, this is where you know, STEM needs to be more important than it is, especially in the U.S. schools. And I really applaud the efforts to sort of elevate that beyond what it was when I was a kid, which was sort of there's a little bit of math and a little bit of science here, but it's just more requirements. It's not real focus, right? But in doing so, I think what we've done is we've kind of pivoted towards, let's put all of our energy over here. The arts aren't important anymore because it's not like math and science and all the other STEM. And I think the question for me is, how are we teaching young people right now how to think creatively, period? Whether it's about mathematics, whether it's about art, whether it's about putting art and mathematics together, right? And and why is one of the reasons why so many people's parents say, engineer, lawyer, doctor. They make a lot of money. And that's one of the things that at least our American society doesn't really value. And I think a lot of Western society no longer values as much as it once did, was the arts and being able to be able to uh, really make a living doing that kind of work, right? And I don't want to, if I had a magic wand to wave to help all of society, it would be the elimination of the idea of a starving artist is the artist, right? I don't want artists to be starving. I want them to be as successful as any other profession, because I think that there's a lot of importance to that. And especially as AI replaces all the things that were so technical in focus, and we don't really need to know as much. The pool of people that need to know how the inner workings of these technology products really work gets smaller and smaller and smaller, because they're really focused on the AI and training them how to do the basics.
Very much so, right?
And at
Very
some
much
point,
so.
AI is going to start answering that question for itself anyway.
Right, because I think you said it very well. I've been sort of talking about this to a number of people, different people in different roles in different parts of the world. And here is my 2 cents, which is how problem solving, the ability of an individual to solve a problem. How can they do it, and how well do they do it, and how fast can they do it? How efficiently can they do it compared to some other person? I think in my mind becomes a more important skill than when I can speak as a developer, right? I mean, can I write code? Can I solve problems? Over the years, how fast you could write code made you sort of a better developer, right? Can you write scalable code? Can you write clean code? But a lot of that can now, you can have the assistance of these tools like Copilot. When you're using an IDE and editor, you can use the help of those tools and those plugins to quote unquote become a better developer, even though you're not doing the job yourself, right? You're kind of cheating. But by virtue of being able to do that, now you can focus your energies on solving problems better, right? Which you may or may not have been able to do. So to me, I always felt like the ability to solve problems was more important than the ability to write code, even as a developer.
Yeah.
But I feel like with AI in the mix, it becomes more and more prominent that, hey, you know what? Things that a bot can do or help you do, you don't want to focus on that as much compared to the items that you have to be doing as a Homo sapien, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
So I think what you say there kind of resonated with me straight away. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think the other part of this is that we have to be immediately starting to teach kids the idea of creative problem solving, and in some ways problem expansion, right? I want more problems to be addressed, not less work, right? This drive towards efficiency is kind of a modern creation, right? Where what do you do? So if you get so efficient that you don't have to do all this extra work, what are you replacing that with? Are you just ending work after 2 hours instead of 8 hours? I mean, that'd be great, but what happens in that other 6 hours? Can you be thinking about, how are you prompting yourself? How are you starting to empower yourself? How have you been trained
And then
to
Jake,
then say, what else can I do?
and multiply that window of time, the extra time that somebody has available, to the more number of people that are coming into existence in this world. And then you have a much larger number, right? The population is 8 billion, and it's going to be like 11 billion at the end of the century. And there are societies that are growing faster in population than other from a geographical standpoint. But overall, as planet Earth, there's going to be a lot more people. And like what you mentioned, you have more time now. Each of us has more time because these tools are doing hopefully will be doing a lot of the work, and more people, more time. So that's why I asked in my to my last guest, I asked Jason this question as we ended the podcast is hell going to break loose? There's going to be a lot of people, and each of us is going to have
Mhm.
lesser things to do to get our job done if we just did the least minimum that we have to do. So, are we looking at apocalypse or something in the near future, or hopefully not? Right? No.
Yeah, and I think so. We could spend all day, all year on this one, but this isn't a again. It's not an efficiency conversation. If I can use AI to reduce what I used to have to do in 8 hours to 2 hours, excellent. That's wonderful. But I don't think that the answer then is I go home after 2 hours, right? And we've got some universal pay in order for me to be able to compensate for the 6 hours I'm not working. We may need universal pay, but it's a whole different discussion. What I think that as humans we have a requirement to, in our DNA, in our core, brainstem, we need to be productive, not efficient, but productive, doing work, doing things that are fulfilling, right? And being able to point at something and say, that's mine, I did that. And so I think the question, again, this is why I go back to, we really have to be training kids in a different way so that they understand that in those other 6 hours I can go do other things, I can expand my brain. I'm not just going to go sit on a beach, or sit in the lounge chair in front of a video game, right? It is pushing humanity forward because I now have an opportunity to do even crazier, bigger things. But I think all that comes back to, how do we train our kids? And as somebody, I mentioned, I went to school for product design, but I actually went to a school that didn't have a formal product design program, and so I built my own. And in the mornings, I'd go to the design school and work with the design students, and in the afternoons, I'd go to the mechanical engineering school and work with the mechanical engineering students. And at lunchtime, I'd sit under a tree and try and translate my brain from one world to the other, because they were very different worlds, as you might imagine. But what that's allowed me to do over the course of my career is to really understand how to communicate between the worlds, right? And that's, in many ways, that's the simplest way I can describe my career is I sit between dissociated people and figure out how to connect them, right? And whether that's companies and communities, or whether that's one team inside a company and another team inside a company, uh, whoever it might be, I really understand how those dynamics work. But that's what I think that's what's going to, I'm totally biased, but I think that's what's going to take us into the future is not having engineering students and art students, but having students that have this combination of skills and an ability to see the world in a cohesive way, not just a singular way.
I would have asked you to summarize the conversation, but you ended up doing that. Whatever you just said there ends up coming, I feel like we've come a whole circle there. So this was amazing. I'm going to ask you one question about Austin, but before I did that, I think I'm good with everything I want to talk about. Is there anything you want to ask me, Jake?
Um, yeah, I think my biggest question would be, how do you take away our conversation and apply it to your own work?
Great question, right? Uh, Here's what I would do, and I've sort of been thinking about that as you've been explaining as well, right? Uh, you know, when I started, I'll give you a quick background here, right? When I started the company, and I'd been building software for a long time. So when I launched the company, I was like, you know what? I'm going to run into engineering problems, and I was, despite having built a lot of different applications over the years, there was that anxiety because I'd never done it in entirety, right? With as a company, so to speak. You were working for somebody, and they had a lot of other people helping you, and you got something done, but not you leading this effort. So I was like, you know what? I was worried about running into engineering problems, and I thought that was the only type of problems that I would run into, and I had to find a way to solve those problems, right? And as you can imagine, like very soon, I mean, not that we don't run into it, right? We run into engineering software issues and we hit the wall all the time, but we find a way to get out of that because we've done this long enough and we back ourselves in being able to do it. But what came as a surprise was everything else that I had either not thought would be a problem, or everything else that I thought wasn't even in the mix of things ended up being in the mix of things and being a problem. And we were not equipped to solving those problems, right? So be it sales, be it picking up, being prospecting on LinkedIn and sending a message to a stranger, things are don't seem difficult on paper, but as an engineer, as somebody who has, it's very, very, very difficult, right? You're like, oh my
Mhm.
God, am I, should I be sending this message? Am I going to offend somebody, even though there's nothing offensive about it, right? Am I, should I be following up? Because we hardly ever do. And a salesperson told me that, Krish, you got to follow up like 7 times. And nowadays, they say like a rule of 21 or something, where people have to see something 21 times before they can react to it. But at least 7 times, we can hardly bring ourselves to follow up the second time, right? It's
Mhm.
impossible. I'm like, am I harassing somebody because I'm sending the second message? It takes it's very painful, right? So those are some of the things that we had never thought would be problems. Right now,
Mhm.
I'm coming back just to answer your question there. One of the things we also have continued to, we've done that wrong many times, is have an exciting idea and go build it in silo without ever thinking about a community or a community voice or getting feedback very early. Because you take the problem, you're excited, you want to solve it, you write code, you then go there, and then you realize, you know what, maybe I solved the wrong problem, maybe I didn't start doing this the right way. So based on what you just, everything that you mentioned, Jake, to me it's not easy, but it's needed regardless. Every step of the way, trying to find out if whatever it is that you're trying to do, does it make sense not just to us, does it make sense to a broader community that's out there? Which means finding the right community, right, for who you're solving this problem, and then finding people who can be representative of that community, because you can't go to the entire community on day one. So how do you find the right people, and everything else that you mentioned about the timing, the outcomes, and the activities, right? Doing that is difficult, and doing that without having somebody who's done that before, like Jake, is even harder, right? Now, if you have all the time and the money, not mostly the time but the money, that you can have a, 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 a person who's able to do this, who's done this many times before, and who's a lot better at doing that, being part of the team is always the ideal solution. But unfortunately, as a startup, you end up not being able to afford that most of the time. So you now end up having 6 people wearing like 16 different hats or 60 different hats. And now how can you do that job very well, right? You cannot. Which is why, taking what you're doing is, whatever you mentioned here is community, the importance of those voices, but in the context of AI as well, which is why I want to ask you those questions. Because if AI can do things that you're doing, now you're able to have that money available to you and time available to you to find people like Jake to solving problems that you would have otherwise had to do so yourself, right? So I mean, that's my summary. Hopefully that makes sense, right? how do
Yeah, it
you
does.
how do you engage people, how do you do things differently from what you've done before? Because otherwise, what is the point in having these conversations if you don't learn from these conversations, right? Learning is not
Right.
just sort of feeling like good about thinking you're learning it, but if you don't put that into practice, then that learning hasn't gone very far, and which it should, right? Otherwise you
Right.
wouldn't be doing justice to that learning. So I mean, does that
Well,
make
and
sense?
it does make sense. And I will say, to give some comfort to the listeners here, there is, there are very big and there are very small CDPD projects, right? There are big strategies that again, 40 people, 40 products getting sent out, months long. I do those projects, but I also do little 1 day projects, right? What are the 3 things we're going to focus on for the next 90 days? And those are completely affordable, even for a startup. Um, but even more than that, this doesn't have to, I'm happy to help. I'm happy to answer questions. People can find my website at jakemckee.com and drop me a line, and we can talk through some of these issues. But um, the the message here is that these don't have to be horribly complex, right? They may be beneficial, but you can also do small things, right? We do a lot of things where
I
we
pulled
go
up,
and ask our
Jake,
friends
just
and
to make
family.
sure, I want to
Yeah,
share this is the right website, right? Jake McKee.
correct. Yeah,
Yep. Okay,
you
cool.
got it.
Perfect. I'm going to include this and the link to your LinkedIn profile. We'll
Yeah,
include
please.
that when you publish the podcast. But sorry, please continue. Yeah.
No, no, that's fine. Yeah, you can start with small little activities that you do on your own. Even with just your gut instincts of, I need to find a few people. We need to talk through this. I've been surprised at how many times, even in small startups, that people are um, forgetting that they have colleagues that don't have as much knowledge as the engineers. Go ask them, right? Say, hey, here's what we're working on. What do you think? What are your initial reactions? And all of a sudden, you get some really great feedback, right? You can ask friends and family. You can ask if you have an existing community. You can just find some of those more leadership oriented voices or the leader of a community and just go to them and say, hey, I want to ask you a few questions. People like being felt, being seen as an expert, right? So going to a few people in your user community or your customer base and saying, hey, I really appreciate what you're doing. I had a couple of questions. I was hoping you could give me some insight. People love that, right? And that doesn't take huge effort. I think that there's a way, an effective way to go about doing some of those conversations. Just like, it's, as you know, doing a podcast, it's hard to interview people generally. And if you don't have the skills or the practice to do that, sometimes it can be harder than if you do. But that doesn't mean that you don't start the podcast anyway, right? You learn as you go. And,
Like
there's,
me. Yeah, this is
yeah,
not what I do. And hopefully, I've been doing it, but I was like, you know what? If somebody is a professional podcaster, I'm sure they'll do a far, far better job. But at least, you have to do what you can do. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, start where you can. If you need some real help, give me a call. I'll help you out.
Perfect. Right. The last thing was about Austin.
Yeah.
Uh, for anybody who either is watching this, listening to it, who lives in the US or perhaps even overseas, who's planning to come here, a couple of things about Austin. Why is it a good place to move to?
Yeah. I've been here
Or
for
is it
15
or is it a
years.
good place to move
Yeah.
to?
It's a very different town than what people might have remembered it being. There's a lot more high rises today than there were when I moved here 15 years ago, uh, but it's still a fun town. It's a really, I've always liked it because it's a collision of cultures, right? It's a very conservative state capital. It's also a very liberal college town. It's deep with tech. For a long time, there was a very rich music culture, right? And there was a lot of different people just showing up together. And that's changed over the years as more and more and more people have come in and more tech has come in, but it still retains a lot of that community orientation, that community culture that as a community guy I really love. And of course, as a foodie, there's all kinds of great food here.
I was going to ask, that's my last thing I was going to ask. I typically ask of most of the guests, what is your favorite food?
Um, Something new and unique. I like it all. We go out to everything from sushi to Caribbean to uh, gastronomy to you name it. If it's interesting, we're down.
But what's comfort food? Like if you're hungry, you don't want to experiment, you're like, you know what, I know I like this. This is what I want to eat. What would that be?
Well, so one of my favorites these days, I've sort of dialed in my jerk chicken. So if I'm cooking, I definitely like to do jerk chicken.
Sorry, you said what chicken?
Jerk chicken, the Jamaican jerk chicken.
Oh, okay, cool. Okay,
Yeah,
nice.
so
I'm
good.
I'm borderline vegan, so I don't know it, but I'm sure folks who are watching it will understand it. Super. Jake, I think this is awesome. Anything else you want to say before we call it wraps?
No, I just really appreciate the invitation. It was a fantastic conversation.
Oh no, thank you so much. This is phenomenal, right? I mean, there's a plenty of things I've learned, and I'm pretty sure everyone's watching this, would feel the same way as well. So again, folks, we had a chat with Jake McKee. I'm going to include links to Jake's website and Jake's LinkedIn profile. If you need, help from somebody who's an expert who's been doing this a while from a community-driven product development standpoint, I'm sure you can appreciate from the conversation from what Jake shared with us as to everything that we sort of need to be aware of, and definitely do reach out to Jake. So with that, I'm going to call it wraps for this podcast. Jake, just hang on for a few seconds after I
Will
hit
do.
record here.
Thank you.
Yep, I've stopped. Yep. Thanks, folks. Yep. Until next time.